She was lashed for refusing marriage until a lonely vampire king. You're safe with me. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The wind moved slowly through the narrow streets of the small American frontier town of Hollow Creek. Lantern light flickered along the wooden buildings while a crowd gathered in uneasy silence at the center of the dusty square. No music played tonight. No laughter drifted from the tavern. Everyone stood shoulder to shoulder around a tall wooden post planted deep in the ground. Bound to that post was a young woman named Emily Carter. Her hands were tied tightly above her head with thick rope. Dust clung to the hem of her worn dress, and strands of chestnut hair had fallen across her face. She did not struggle. She did not scream. She simply stood there, breathing slowly, as if gathering every ounce of strength left inside her. A heavy-set man, wearing a dark sheriff coat, stepped forward holding a long leather whip. His boots crushed gravel as he approached. Beside him stood another man dressed in expensive black clothing. His smile was thin and cruel. His name was Victor Hawthorne, the wealthiest landowner for miles around Hollow Creek. Tonight, he had come to claim what he believed already belonged to him. The sheriff cleared his throat loudly so the entire square could hear. This woman stands accused of refusing a lawful marriage agreement to Mr. Victor Hawthorne. Her refusal dishonors the contract and the authority of this town. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people lowered their eyes. Others watched with tight jaws and helpless anger. Everyone knew the truth. Victor Hawthorne had forced the marriage proposal on Emily after buying the debt left behind by her late father. If she married him, the debt would vanish. If she refused, punishment would follow. Emily lifted her head and looked directly at Victor. Her voice came out quiet but steady. I will never marry you. Victor laughed softly as if the entire scene amused him. Pride is a dangerous thing for a poor girl. He gestured toward the sheriff. The whip cracked through the cold night air. The sound echoed against the wooden buildings and made several people flinch. Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment, but no cry escaped her lips. The crowd shifted uneasily. A second crack followed. Then silence returned to the square like a heavy blanket. Somewhere beyond the edge of town, the distant rumble of an approaching carriage rolled along the road. Few people noticed it at first, but the horses pulling that carriage suddenly slowed as they entered the lantern light. The black carriage stopped at the far side of the square. Its polished surface reflected the trembling glow of firelight. The door opened slowly. A tall man stepped down onto the dusty street. His long dark coat moved gently in the wind. His pale eyes studied the scene before him with quiet stillness. None of the townspeople knew his name. None of them understood that the stranger standing there had walked the earth for centuries. And at the exact moment the sheriff lifted the whip again, a calm voice carried across the silent square. Stop! The sheriff froze. The whip hung in the air above Emily Carter as every head in the square slowly turned toward the voice that had spoken. The stranger stood near the black carriage at the edge of the lantern light. He had not raised his voice. He had not moved quickly. Yet the single word he had spoken carried across the square with a calm authority that made the night feel suddenly colder. Stop! The sheriff lowered the whip slightly and frowned. Who said that? The stranger began walking forward. His steps were slow and measured as his boots pressed into the dust of Hollow Creek. The wind tugged at the long dark coat resting across his shoulders. Lantern light revealed a pale face framed by dark hair and eyes that seemed far older than the town itself. Emily lifted her head. Through the blur of pain and exhaustion, she watched the man approach. She had never seen him before. No one in Hollow Creek dressed like that. No one carried themselves with that kind of quiet power. Victor Hawthorne narrowed his eyes as the stranger moved closer. This does not concern you. He spoke with the smug confidence of a man used to owning everything around him. The sheriff glanced between them uncertainly. The crowd shifted. People leaned forward as curiosity began to replace fear. The stranger stopped several yards away from the wooden post where Emily stood bound. For a long moment, he simply observed the scene. His gaze moved from the whip in the sheriff's hands to the ropes cutting into Emily's wrists. Then his eyes rested on Victor Hawthorne. The silence stretched across the square. Victor scoffed and stepped forward. You must be passing through. If that is the case, then you should keep moving. Hollow Creek handles its own matters. The stranger tilted his head slightly, as if studying Victor the way a scientist might examine a specimen under glass. And what matter requires this punishment? His voice was calm and deep. Victor spread his arms toward Emily. That woman refused a lawful marriage contract. Her father owed me money. When he died, the debt passed to her. I offered a simple solution. Marriage. She refused. The stranger turned his eyes toward Emily again. Is that true? Emily swallowed slowly. Her voice came out hoarse but steady. My father never agreed to sell me like property. Victor purchased the debt after he died. He thought that meant he owned me. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Some people looked down. Others nodded quietly because everyone in Hollow Creek knew Victor had bought half the town with debts and threats. The stranger studied Emily's face for a long moment. Lantern light flickered across the red marks on her back and shoulders where the whip had struck. Yet she still stood straight against the post. Her chin remained lifted. She had not begged once. The stranger spoke again. Why did you refuse him? Victor laughed loudly. Does that matter? She belongs to me. The stranger did not look at Victor this time. He kept his gaze on Emily. I asked you. Emily took a slow breath. Because he destroys everything he touches. My neighbor daughter worked in his house. She ran away after 2 months. My father warned me about men like him before he died. I would rather face this square than spend one day as his wife. The wind drifted through the square again, carrying the scent of dust and lantern oil. The stranger's eyes narrowed slightly as if those words had stirred something old inside him. Victor's impatience finally snapped. Enough of this. Sheriff finished the punishment. The sheriff raised the whip again, but his hands trembled now. Something about the stranger presence made the air feel wrong. The stranger stepped forward one more pace. You will not strike her again. Victor's expression hardened with anger. And who exactly are you to give orders in my town? The stranger gaze moved slowly across the crowd. People began stepping back without realizing why. The horses pulling the black carriage stamped their hooves nervously. Even the wind seemed to pause. The stranger answered quietly. A traveler. Victor scoffed. Then travel somewhere else. The sheriff lifted the whip again. Before it could fall, the stranger raised his hand slightly. The motion was small, almost gentle, yet every lantern flame in the square flickered violently at the same moment. A cold wave moved through the crowd. Victor's voice lost its confidence. What did you just do? The stranger lowered his hand and looked at Emily Carter once more. His voice was softer now, but carried a weight that seemed to press against every building in Hollow Creek. I asked them to stop, and they will. The square remained frozen after the stranger words settled into the cold night air. The sheriff still held the whip raised, but his arm no longer moved. It was as if the command had reached deeper than his ears and settled somewhere inside his bones. Victor Hawthorne stared at the stranger with growing disbelief. No one had ever spoken to him like this in Hollow Creek. This town runs on my authority. Victor's voice sharpened as anger replaced surprise. You do not walk in from some dusty road and start giving commands. The stranger stood perfectly still. His expression did not change. The lantern light reflected faintly in his pale eyes. You mistake something important. His voice was calm, but carried a quiet certainty that made several people in the crowd step back without realizing why. Victor laughed loudly again, but the sound felt forced this time. Doi. The stranger slowly turned his gaze toward the sheriff. Lower the whip. The sheriff's hand shook. For a moment, it looked like he might resist. Then his arm slowly dropped to his side. The leather whip brushed against the dirt with a soft thud. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind moving through dry grass. Victor's face darkened. Sheriff, what are you doing? Finish it. The sheriff did not move. Sweat formed along his forehead despite the cold wind drifting through the square. I cannot. Victor stepped closer and grabbed the man's shoulder. You cannot. You work for this town. You work for me. The sheriff swallowed hard and pulled his arm free. Something is wrong here, Victor. The stranger took another slow step toward the wooden post. Each movement felt deliberate, as if he carried all the time in the world. Emily Carter watched him approach through half-closed eyes. Pain burned along her back, but something else had replaced the fear that filled the square only moments earlier. The man's presence felt like standing near a storm that had not decided whether to destroy everything or pass quietly overhead. The stranger stopped only a few feet away from her. He looked up at the ropes, binding her wrists to the rough wood beam above her head. The fibers had cut deep into her skin. You have endured this punishment without pleading once. His voice was quieter now, but Emily heard every word. Why? Emily breathed slowly before answering. Because begging would not change anything. Victor would still take what he wants. The stranger studied her face carefully, as if searching for any hint of weakness. Instead, he found only exhaustion and stubborn resolve. The crowd watched in silence. No one dared interrupt. Victor finally stepped forward again with fury in his eyes. I will not tolerate this interruption any longer. This woman is bound by contract. Her father owed me a debt that equals the value of half this town. I offered mercy through marriage. She refused. Therefore, punishment continues. The stranger turned toward Victor at last. A debt. Victor lifted his chin proudly. That is correct. The stranger voice remained even. And you believe that gives you the right to claim her life. Victor spread his hands, as if explaining something obvious to a child. That is how power works. The strong collect what they are owed. A quiet stillness settled across the square. The stranger expression changed only slightly, but something ancient flickered behind his eyes. You speak of power as if you understand it. Victor stepped closer until he stood only a few feet away. I own the largest land holdings in 3 counties. I control the grain shipments and the trade roads. This town survives because I allow it. The stranger gaze did not move. That is not power. Victor laughed again, though the sound carried less confidence than before. Then enlighten us, traveler. What is power? For the first time, the stranger allowed a faint shadow of a smile to touch his face. Real power is when the entire world changes direction because you speak a single word. At that moment, the wind sweeping through Hollow Creek shifted suddenly. The lantern flames around the square bent low, as if bowing to an unseen force. Several horses tied near the saloon began stamping nervously against the ground. The crowd felt the temperature drop so quickly that many wrapped their arms around themselves for warmth. Victor's expression faltered. What are you? The stranger ignored the question. Instead, he looked back at Emily Carter. Then, with a single smooth motion, he reached up and placed his hand against the thick rope binding her wrists. The moment his fingers touched the rope, every person in the square felt the same strange sensation ripple through the air like distant thunder waiting just beyond the horizon. The moment the stranger hand touched the thick rope above Emily Carter's wrists, the strange pressure in the air deepened. It was not loud. There was no flash of light or explosion of sound. Yet every person standing in the square felt something change, as if the world itself had drawn a slow breath. The rope snapped. The heavy fibers fell apart in the stranger hand like dry threads. Gasps rose from the crowd. Emily's arms dropped weakly to her sides, and she almost collapsed before catching herself against the wooden post. Victor Hawthorne stepped backward with sudden alarm. That rope had been tied tight by 2 grown men only minutes earlier. No knife had cut it. No blade had touched it. It had simply broken apart beneath the stranger's fingers, as if the material had forgotten how to hold together. What trick is this? Victor demanded. The stranger did not answer him. Instead, he reached out and gently steadied Emily by the shoulder so she would not fall. His hand remained there only long enough for her balance to return. Then he stepped back half a pace, giving her space to stand on her own feet. Emily lifted her eyes to him. Up close, she could see that his face looked young, but something in his gaze felt impossibly ancient. Who are you? She asked quietly. The stranger did not answer immediately. His attention had shifted again toward Victor Hawthorne. The landowner had regained enough of his confidence to step forward with renewed anger burning in his expression. That rope breaking does not change anything. Victor snapped. This woman still owes me a debt. The punishment was lawful and witnessed by the entire town. The sheriff cleared his throat nervously, but said nothing. Victor pointed toward Emily. She belongs to me until that debt is repaid. The stranger voice remained calm. No human being belongs to another. Victor laughed harshly. That might sound noble where you come from, traveler, but this is Hollow Creek. Here debts are settled the old way. Emily straightened slowly despite the pain across her back. I will repay the money if you give me time. Victor sneered. Time is exactly what you no longer have. His gaze shifted toward the sheriff again. Bind her again. This interruption ends now. The sheriff hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the stranger who still stood quietly beside Emily. Something about the man's presence made every instinct scream that obeying Victor might be a terrible mistake. Victor saw the hesitation and shouted louder. Sheriff, do your job. The sheriff took a reluctant step forward, holding the rope that had fallen to the dirt. The stranger spoke again before he could reach Emily. You were warned. His voice carried across the square with the same quiet authority that had stopped the whip earlier. The sheriff froze in place once more. Victor clenched his fists in fury. You cannot command my people. The stranger finally turned fully toward him. The lantern light revealed the faintest trace of something unnatural in his eyes now. They reflected the firelight in a way that made the glow appear deeper and darker than it should have been. I'm not commanding them. Victor scowled. Then what are you doing? The stranger answered slowly. I am giving them a chance to make a wiser decision. The wind that had been drifting through the town square suddenly turned colder. Several lantern flames flickered violently again. The horses tied near the saloon began pulling against their reins as if they sensed a predator somewhere nearby. Victor noticed the reaction in his. Anger wavered for the first time. What are you? He demanded again, though this time the question carried less confidence and more unease. The stranger studied him in silence for a long moment. Then he spoke words that made the air in the square feel even heavier. I am someone who has watched men like you for longer than your town has existed. Murmurs spread quickly through the crowd. Victor shook his head dismissively, though a bead of sweat had formed along his temple. You expect me to believe some fairy tale about ancient power. You are nothing more than a man interfering in a lawful matter. The stranger gaze did not change. If you truly believe that, then continue. Victor stared at him, trying to read whether the calm confidence was bluff or something far more dangerous. Finally, his pride pushed him forward. He pointed again toward Emily Carter. Sheriff, finish it. The sheriff lifted the rope again, but his hands trembled violently. The stranger turned his head slightly toward Emily and spoke in a voice only she could clearly hear. Do you still refuse the marriage? Emily did not hesitate. Yes. The stranger nodded once. Good. Then his eyes lifted toward Victor Hawthorne again, and the calm tone returned to his voice. Then this ends now. The square fell silent after the stranger words settled into the cold air. Then this ends now. The sentence sounded simple, but something in the way he spoke it made every person in Hollow Creek feel as if the ground beneath their boots had shifted. Victor Hawthorne forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. Ends now. You think you can simply declare that and change the law of this town? The stranger did not move. He simply stood beside Emily Carter as the wind stirred the dust across the square. The lantern flames began to flicker more violently now, as if an invisible storm had arrived without clouds or thunder. The sheriff still held the rope in shaking hands. Finish it. Victor shouted again, though his voice carried a new edge of uncertainty. The sheriff tried to step forward, but his boots refused to move. The cold spreading through the square felt unnatural. Several people in the crowd began whispering to each other. Something is wrong. Did you feel that? Even the horses tied along the street were pulling hard against their reins now, with wide eyes and flared nostrils. Animals often sensed danger before humans understood it. Victor noticed the unease spreading through the crowd and turned back toward the stranger with growing frustration. What kind of trick are you playing? The stranger eyes slowly lifted toward the lantern hanging above the center of the square. The small flame inside the glass suddenly stretched tall, then bent sharply as if pushed by a powerful wind that no one else could feel. Victor's voice dropped lower. Stop that. The stranger lowered his gaze again. I'm not doing anything. The world simply reacts to certain truths. Victor clenched his jaw. What truth? For the first time, the stranger turned slightly so that the lantern light illuminated his face more clearly. The unnatural reflection returned to his eyes again. It was faint but unmistakable. The glow of the flames inside the lanterns seemed to sink into his pupils rather than reflect from them. I told you earlier that power is when the world changes direction because someone speaks a word. Victor swallowed before answering, though he tried to hide the motion. You are bluffing. The stranger looked toward the sheriff again. Put the rope down. The sheriff dropped it immediately, as if the command had broken the last of his resistance. The rope landed in the dust with a dull thud. Murmurs rose through the crowd again, louder this time. Victor turned sharply toward the sheriff. Pick that up. The sheriff shook his head slowly. I cannot. Victor stepped closer and grabbed the man's coat collar. You cannot, or you will not. The sheriff's eyes darted toward the stranger again. Something about him makes it feel like the air itself is watching us. Victor released the collar and turned back toward the stranger with open fury. Enough of this nonsense. Who are you? The stranger studied Victor's face for a long moment. The wind grew colder again, and a strange stillness fell across the square, as if even the night insects had decided to remain silent. Then the stranger spoke slowly. My name will mean nothing to you. Victor sneered, though the gesture looked weaker than before. Try me. The stranger stepped forward one pace, and the temperature around him seemed to drop another degree. I have lived long enough to see cities rise from empty land and fall back into dust again. Victor laughed sharply, but no one else in the square joined him. That is impossible. The stranger's voice remained calm. Many things are impossible until you meet the one who breaks the rule. The lantern above them flickered once more, and several flames nearly went out before rising again. Emily Carter watched the exchange quietly while leaning against the wooden post for support. The pain across her back had not faded, but something else had begun to replace it. A strange feeling of safety had appeared the moment the stranger had stepped beside her. Victor took another step back without realizing it. His voice came out slower now. What are you? The stranger finally answered. I am someone who protects what should never be owned. Victor forced himself to stand tall again, though the fear creeping into his chest was becoming harder to hide. You expect me to believe some wandering guardian story. The stranger gaze hardened slightly for the first time. Believe whatever you wish. The truth does not require your permission. The wind suddenly surged through the square again, strong enough to make several lanterns swing on their hooks. The stranger voice lowered to a calm whisper that somehow carried across the entire crowd. But if you continue this cruelty, you will learn exactly who I am. And when that moment comes, Victor Hawthorne, you will wish this night had never begun. Victor Hawthorne felt the shift before he understood it. The wind that had been swirling through Hollow Creek suddenly died, leaving the square wrapped in an unnatural stillness. The lanterns stopped swinging. The horses stopped pulling at their reins. Even the whispering crowd seemed to fall silent at the same moment, as if some invisible signal had passed through the air. The stranger stood beside Emily Carter with the same calm posture he had held since stepping out of the black carriage. Yet something about him had changed. The quiet confidence in his voice no longer felt like the calm of a traveler passing through town. It felt like the patience of something far older. Victor forced himself to speak again, though his throat had begun to feel dry. You stand here, speaking in riddles and threatening a man who owns half the land in this valley. He spread his arms toward the watching crowd. These people know exactly who I am. They know what power looks like. The stranger slowly turned his gaze toward the people gathered around the square. One by one, their voices faded completely. Many lowered their eyes the moment his attention passed over them. The sheriff shifted his weight nervously. The stranger's voice returned calm and measured. They know what fear looks like. Victor's face reddened. That is not the same thing. The stranger looked back at him. Often it is. Victor took a step forward again, trying to regain control of the moment. If you want to play the role of some wandering hero, then perhaps you should remember that this is still my town. My laws decide what happens here. The stranger studied him for another long moment. Then he spoke in a tone that carried through the square without rising in volume. And if your laws are cruel, Victor answered immediately, then there's still my laws. The crowd shifted uneasily at the blunt honesty of the answer. Several people who had once worked the Hawthorne farms lowered their heads again, remembering the long hours and the threats that followed any complaint. The stranger nodded slowly. I see. Victor felt a brief flash of triumph, thinking he had finally forced the mysterious traveler into silence. Then the stranger spoke again. The problem is that your laws only exist as long as no one stronger arrives to challenge them. Victor scoffed, though the sound lacked its earlier confidence. Stronger than me. You have not even told anyone your name. The stranger eyes remained fixed on him. Names are useful when two men stand as equals. Victor lifted his chin. And we're not equals. No, the stranger replied quietly. We are not. A ripple of tension spread through the watching townspeople. The temperature seemed to drop another degree, and several lantern flames flickered once more as if reacting to the tension building between the two men. Victor forced a harsh laugh. Let me guess. You are about to claim you are some ancient warrior from a forgotten land. Perhaps you will tell us you fought kings and conquered armies. The stranger expression did not change. Victor continued speaking louder, now trying to pull the crowd back to his side. I have heard these stories before. Travelers arrive with dramatic voices and mysterious pasts, hoping to impress simple people. But eventually they leave when they realize. Hollow Creek belongs to me. The stranger finally turned away from him and looked at Emily Carter again. She was still leaning against the wooden post, breathing slowly as she tried to remain standing despite the pain in her back. The stranger voice softened slightly when he addressed her. Can you walk? Emily hesitated before answering. Yes, I think so. Victor immediately stepped forward, blocking the space between them. She's not going anywhere. The stranger gaze lifted slowly to meet his again. That decision no longer belongs to you. Victor clenched his fists. The debt still exists. Someone must pay it. The stranger answered calmly. Then I will pay it. The square erupted in shocked murmurs. Victor blinked in confusion. You. The stranger nodded once. Tell me the value of the debt you believe gives you the right to claim her life. Victor hesitated for a moment, calculating quickly. If the traveler truly intended to pay, then perhaps the problem could still turn to his advantage. The debt equals the cost of the land her father mortgaged plus interest for every year since his death. Victor's voice sharpened again as his greed returned. The amount is far beyond what any traveler could carry. The stranger looked at him without blinking. Then say it. Victor spoke the number, slowly making sure the crowd heard every word. $10,000. The stranger expression remained perfectly calm. Is that all? Victor stared at him. That is more money than most men in this town will see in their entire lives. The stranger reached into the inside of his dark coat, and the entire square held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The entire square held its breath as the stranger reached inside his dark coat. Victor Hawthorne watched closely with narrowed eyes, convinced the traveler had made a foolish promise he could never fulfill. $10,000 was more money than most ranchers in the county would earn across many years of hard labor. The crowd leaned forward slightly, lantern light flickering across curious faces as everyone waited to see what the stranger would reveal. The man withdrew his hand slowly and opened his palm. At first, Victor frowned in confusion because the object resting in the stranger hand did not look like a bundle of money. It was a small piece of metal, round and dark with a faint gleam of gold beneath the lantern light. The stranger held it between two fingers for a moment before extending it toward Victor. The landowner stared at it with growing irritation. What is this supposed to be? The stranger voice remained calm. Payment. Victor barked a harsh laugh. Payment. You think one coin will cover a debt of $10,000. The stranger did not react to the insult. Instead, he said quietly, "That coin is older than your entire town." Victor rolled his eyes. "I do not care if it is older than the mountains. It is still one coin." The stranger tilted the coin slightly, so the lantern light struck its surface more clearly. Intricate markings appeared along the edge of the metal, and at the center rested a carved emblem that none of the townspeople recognized. The sheriff leaned forward, squinting at it. Victor snatched the coin from the stranger's hand with a frustrated grunt. "Fine, then let us see this miracle coin." He turned it over in his fingers, examining both sides. At first his expression remained smug, but slowly the confidence drained from his face. The color faded from his cheeks as he studied the design more carefully. "Where did you get this?" Victor asked quietly. The stranger answered simply, "I have carried it for a long time." Victor's eyes lifted sharply. "You expect me to believe that story?" The stranger's gaze remained steady. "Believe whatever explanation helps you sleep tonight." Victor looked back down at the coin again. His fingers trembled slightly now because he had seen something on the surface that he could not ignore. The sheriff noticed the change in Victor's expression. "What is it?" Victor hesitated before answering. "This coin is not American currency. It is not from any country I recognize." The stranger nodded. "That is correct." Victor's voice lowered further. "The metal is pure gold. The weight alone makes it worth a fortune." Murmurs spread through the crowd again as several people tried to glimpse the coin from where they stood. Victor turned the coin over once more, staring at the carved emblem in the center. There was a crown etched above a single drop shape that looked almost like a tear or a drop of blood. Victor swallowed. "I have seen a symbol like this before." The stranger's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened slightly. Victor slowly raised his head again. "The symbol appeared in an old ledger that belonged to my grandfather. It described ancient coins once used by European royal houses. Coins so rare that collectors would pay a small fortune for even one." The stranger remained silent, allowing Victor to continue the realization on his own. Victor's voice came out almost as a whisper. "That ledger claimed one coin like this could purchase land the size of an entire valley." The sheriff stared at Victor in disbelief. "Are you saying that coin is worth more than the debt?" Victor did not answer immediately. He was still staring at the stranger with growing unease. The calm confidence in the traveler's face suddenly made much more sense. Victor finally spoke again, though the arrogance in his voice had faded. "One coin like this would easily cover $10,000. The stranger nodded once. "Then the debt is paid." The crowd erupted into louder whispers as the meaning of those words settled into the square. Emily Carter leaned against the wooden post, watching the exchange with disbelief. Victor slowly closed his fingers around the coin, as if testing whether it might vanish like an illusion. "You would give away something this valuable for a stranger?" The stranger looked toward Emily briefly before answering. "She's not a stranger." Victor frowned. "You have known her for less than an hour." The stranger's gaze returned to him. "Time does not decide who deserves protection." Victor felt the weight of the coin in his palm again, and the strange unease returned to his chest. "Who exactly are you?" The stranger's voice dropped lower than before. "I told you already. I am someone who protects what should never belong to men like you." Victor looked down at the coin one final time before slowly sliding it into his pocket. "The debt is paid," he admitted reluctantly. "But that does not explain why the entire night feels like it is about to change." Victor Hawthorne stood motionless for several seconds after sliding the ancient coin into his pocket. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder as the people of Hollow Creek slowly realized what had just happened. The debt that had chained Emily Carter to Victor authority was gone. Paid in full. The sheriff rubbed the back of his neck uneasily and looked toward Victor as if waiting for new instructions. Victor finally cleared his throat and forced his voice to sound steady again. "The debt is paid." He repeated the words carefully, though the taste of them seemed bitter. "The contract no longer binds her." The crowd shifted again, and several people nodded quietly. A few even allowed themselves small smiles. Emily Carter slowly pushed herself away from the wooden post. Her legs trembled slightly after standing bound for so long, but she remained upright. For the first time since the punishment had begun, she was no longer a prisoner in the center of the square. The stranger stood beside her in silence, watching the reaction ripple through the crowd. Victor forced another tight smile and spread his arms as if the entire confrontation had merely been a minor inconvenience. Well then, it appears our business here is finished. He glanced toward the sheriff. Remove the post. The sheriff nodded quickly and stepped forward with two other men to begin loosening the base of the wooden beam from the dirt. Victor turned back toward the stranger again, though his eyes now held a cautious distance that had not been there earlier. You have settled the debt. I will not deny that. The stranger inclined his head slightly, but said nothing. Victor studied him carefully before continuing. However, that does not mean I trust you. The stranger answered calmly. I did not ask for your trust. Victor gave a short laugh that carried no humor. No, I suppose you did not. He glanced briefly toward Emily again. You're free to go wherever you wish now. But Hollow Creek is still my town. I suggest you both remember that. The stranger voice remained steady. Your authority ended the moment the debt was paid. Victor's smile faded slightly. My influence in this valley is larger than a single debt. You will discover that soon enough if you choose to stay. The stranger regarded him with the same calm patience he had shown since arriving. We will see. Victor exhaled slowly and then turned toward the watching crowd once more. The show is over. Go back to your homes. The townspeople began to drift away in small groups, whispering to one another about the coin, the broken rope, and the stranger whose presence had turned the night upside down. Yet many of them kept glancing back over their shoulders, as if unwilling to miss whatever might happen next. Emily remained where she stood, her arms wrapped lightly around herself as the cool night air brushed against the marks left by the whip. She looked toward the stranger with quiet uncertainty. You did not have to do that. The stranger turned his attention toward her. Yes, I did. Emily frowned slightly. Why? The stranger studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Because cruelty like that spreads when no one stops it. Emily lowered her gaze for a moment before nodding slowly. Victor had already begun walking away toward the large brick building that served as his office and trading post at the edge of the square. Halfway there, he stopped and turned back once more. His eyes rested on the stranger with a thoughtful expression that had replaced his earlier anger. There was one question that still lingered in his mind. He called across the square. Traveler. The stranger looked toward him again. Victor spoke slowly. You gave away a coin worth more than most men could earn in a lifetime. You stepped into a conflict that had nothing to do with you. And you speak as if you have watched the world longer than any man should. Victor tilted his head slightly. I find myself wondering something. The stranger waited. Victor's voice lowered slightly, though the entire square still heard the question. If you're not just a traveler passing through Hollow Creek, then what exactly are you? The wind drifted through the square again, lifting the stranger dark coat slightly around his shoulders. He looked at Victor for a long moment before answering. Someone who has seen far too many nights like this one. Victor narrowed his eyes. That still does not explain who you are. The stranger voice softened but carried a weight that made the remaining townspeople stop where they stood. It explains enough for now. Victor studied him a moment longer before giving a slow nod. Very well, then traveler. But remember something. This valley has a long memory. So do I. With that he turned and continued walking toward the trading post, though the unease in his shoulders made it clear that tonight had shaken more than his pride. The stranger watched him leave before turning back toward Emily Carter, unaware that several figures had quietly stepped from the black carriage. At the edge of the square, and were now observing the entire scene with careful attention. The square slowly began to empty as the people of Hollow Creek drifted back toward their homes, though the tension of the night still clung to the air like the fading echo of a storm. Emily Carter remained near the center of the square, standing quietly as the last lanterns flickered above the dusty street. The stranger watched Victor Hawthorne disappear into the distance before turning back toward her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind carried the faint scent of pine from the dark hills beyond the town, and somewhere far away a night bird called once before falling silent again. Emily finally drew a slow breath and looked up at the stranger. I do not know how to thank you. The stranger studied her face carefully. His expression had softened slightly now that the confrontation had ended. "You do not need to thank me." Emily shook her head gently. "You gave away something worth a fortune for someone you had never met before tonight. Most people would have walked away." The stranger gaze shifted briefly toward the road, leading out of town, as if measuring distances no one else could see. Most people would have ignored what they saw here tonight. Emily lowered her eyes for a moment. Many already did. The stranger did not argue with that. The quiet truth of her words hung between them. After a few seconds, he spoke again. "Do you have somewhere safe to go?" Emily hesitated before answering. "I had a small house on the edge of town. Victor claimed it when my father debt passed him. I suppose it belongs to him now as well." The stranger expression darkened slightly, though his voice remained calm. "Then you will not stay here tonight." Emily looked up again with confusion. "Where would I go?" The stranger turned slightly toward the black carriage waiting at the far side of the square. "You will leave this town." Emily followed his gaze and saw the carriage more clearly now. The horses stood quietly beside it, and several figures in dark coats remained near the wheels, watching the square with calm patience. She had been too exhausted earlier to notice them clearly. "Your carriage?" she asked quietly. The stranger nodded. Emily looked back toward the empty street, where Victor Hawthorne had disappeared. Leaving town tonight might be the only way to avoid whatever anger he might return with in the morning. Yet uncertainty still lingered in her voice. "I do not even know your name." The stranger regarded her for a moment before answering. "Adrian." Emily repeated the name, softly as if testing it. "Adrian." The sound of it felt unfamiliar, yet strangely steady. "Thank you, Adrian." The man nodded once, but did not speak further. One of the dark-coated figures near the carriage stepped forward then, moving with quiet grace across the square. The man stopped several feet away from Adrian and lowered his head respectfully. "My lord, the carriage is prepared." Emily blinked at the words. "My lord." She looked from the man back to Adrian in confusion. Adrian's expression remained calm, though the title had clearly not surprised him. "Thank you, Marcus." The man called Marcus glanced briefly toward Emily before speaking again. "Shall we depart immediately?" Adrian considered the nearly empty square for a moment. "Yes. Hollow Creek has already seen enough tonight." Marcus inclined his head again and returned to the carriage to prepare the horses. Emily turned slowly toward Adrian with uncertainty filling her voice. "My lord." She repeated the unfamiliar title. The stranger watched her reaction quietly. "You did not know." Emily shook her head slowly. "No." Adrian allowed a faint breath of amusement to escape him, though his eyes remained thoughtful. "That is probably for the best." Emily folded her arms lightly around herself as the night wind brushed against her shoulders again. "You saved my life and paid a debt that should have buried me forever. If I am about to step into your carriage and leave everything I have ever known behind, then I would like to understand who you are." Adrian looked at her for several long seconds. The lantern light reflected in his pale eyes again, but now the glow seemed deeper and more ancient than before. Finally, he spoke in a voice that carried the quiet weight of a truth that had existed long before Hollow Creek was ever built. "I am the king of a world that hides in the shadows of yours." Emily stared at him in stunned silence. Adrian's gaze shifted toward the dark hills beyond the town, where the night seemed thicker and deeper than the lantern light could reach. "And tonight, Emily Carter, you have just stepped into that world." Emily Carter stood frozen in the quiet square as Adrian's words settled into her mind. "I am the king of a world that hides in the shadows of yours." The sentence felt impossible, and yet something inside her knew it was not a joke. Too many strange things had already happened tonight for her to dismiss it as madness. The broken rope, the ancient coin, the way the air itself seemed to obey him when he spoke. Emily searched his face again. Adrian's expression remained calm, but there was no humor in his eyes. "You're serious," she whispered. Adrian nodded once. "Very." Emily let out a slow breath and looked toward the dark hills surrounding Hollow Creek. Her entire life had existed inside the simple borders of this valley. Now the stranger standing beside her was calmly telling her that another world existed beyond everything she understood. A world ruled by him. What kind of king? She asked quietly. Adrian's gaze drifted toward the black carriage waiting across the square. The lantern light caught the pale edges of his face, and for the first time, Emily noticed something unusual about the way the shadows moved around him. A king whose people live in the night. Emily felt a chill travel down her spine, though the air had not grown colder. The night. Adrian looked back at her and answered with the same steady voice. My kind has many names depending on who is telling the story. Some call us monsters. Some call us legends. Emily swallowed slowly as the meaning began to form in her mind. You mean vampires? Adrian did not react with surprise. The word had clearly been spoken about him many times before. Yes. Emily stared at him in silence for several seconds. Strangely, the fear she expected to feel never arrived. Instead, she remembered the moment he had stepped into the square and stopped the whip with a single word. She remembered the calm way he had stood between her and Victor Hawthorne without hesitation. If you truly were a monster, then you would not have helped me tonight. Adrian studied her reaction carefully. Many humans would not share your conclusion. Emily shrugged faintly, though the movement made her wince from the soreness across her back. Many humans did not stand tied to that post tonight either. Adrian allowed a faint shadow of approval to cross his face. Marcus returned from the carriage then and stopped beside Adrian once more. My lord, the road is clear and the horses are ready. Adrian nodded without looking away from Emily. Good. Emily glanced toward the carriage again and then back to Adrian. If I leave with you tonight, then I will never return to Hollow Creek, will I? Adrian answered honestly. Probably not. Victor Hawthorne will not forget what happened here. Emily looked around the square one last time. The wooden buildings of the town where she had grown up looked smaller now, somehow. The place had once felt like her entire world, but tonight it seemed little more than a narrow cage. She turned back to Adrian. Where will we go? Adrian replied simply. Home. Emily tilted her head slightly. Your castle. Adrian gave a small nod. It is not far from here. The mountains hide many things people prefer not to believe exist. Emily folded her arms lightly against the cool night air and studied him again. One question still lingered in her mind. When you touched the rope earlier, something strange happened. The air changed. Adrian waited patiently. Emily continued. It felt like the night itself was listening to you. Adrian's expression grew thoughtful. That is because it was. Emily raised an eyebrow. You control the night. Adrian shook his head slightly. No one controls the night. But my kind has lived inside it for a very long time. We understand how it moves. Emily considered that answer carefully before nodding once. Then she drew a deeper breath and looked toward the carriage again. I suppose my life already changed the moment you stopped that whip. Adrian's voice softened slightly. Yes, it did. Emily met his gaze again with quiet determination. Then I will take that ride. Adrian inclined his head and extended his hand toward the carriage waiting at the edge of the square. Emily Carter stepped forward beside him, and together they walked toward the dark vehicle as the last lantern in Hollow Creek flickered behind them, unaware that the choice she had just made would awaken a secret far older than the town itself. The heavy door of the black carriage closed softly behind Emily Carter as she stepped inside. The interior was larger than she expected, lined with dark velvet seats and polished wood that carried the faint scent of cedar. Lantern light from the square slipped through the carriage window for a brief moment before the driver lifted the reins and the horses began to move. Hollow Creek slowly faded behind them. The wheels rolled across the dusty road with a steady rhythm as the carriage left the last lantern of the town far in the distance. Emily sat quietly across from Adrian, still absorbing the reality of everything that had happened in the past hour. Her entire life had shifted in the span of a single night. The man sitting across from her was not simply a traveler. He was a king, and not a human one. The carriage moved deeper into the dark countryside where the moonlight painted the open fields in pale silver. Emily watched the shadows of trees pass across the window before finally speaking again. How far is your home? Adrian rested one arm along the side of the seat while answering calmly. Less than an hour from here. The mountains you saw beyond the town hide the valley where my people live. Emily nodded slowly, though her thoughts remained unsettled. Your people. Adrian inclined his head slightly. Vampires rarely build their homes where humans can easily find them. Emily studied him again carefully. If that is true, then why were you traveling through Hollow Creek tonight? Adrian's gaze drifted toward the dark road outside the window. I was returning from a council meeting held farther south. Emily frowned slightly. A council of vampires. Adrian nodded once. My kingdom includes many clans and territories. Leaders must meet from time to prevent disputes from becoming wars. Emily let out a quiet breath. She had grown up hearing stories about creatures hiding in the night, but those tales had always felt distant and unreal. Now she was riding in a carriage beside their king, while traveling toward their hidden home. The thought should have terrified her, but strangely the calm presence Adrian carried made the situation feel less frightening than it should have been. The carriage climbed slowly along a narrow road that wound toward the mountains. Outside the window, the dark shapes of pine forests rose along the hillsides. After several minutes, Adrian spoke again. How are your injuries? Emily shifted slightly against the seat. The soreness across her back reminded her of the answer immediately. It will heal. Adrian's expression tightened slightly. That should never have happened. Emily shook her head gently. People like Victor Hawthorne exist everywhere. Adrian's voice lowered slightly. Not in my kingdom. The certainty in his tone made Emily glance up again. You truly rule over all vampires in these mountains. Adrian answered without hesitation. Yes, my family has protected these lands for centuries. Emily absorbed the statement slowly. Centuries. The word carried a weight that reminded her how different Adrian's life must be from her own. The carriage finally slowed as the road curved sharply between two towering cliffs. Ahead of them, the forest opened suddenly into a wide hidden valley surrounded by dark mountains on every side. Emily leaned slightly toward the window in amazement. In the distance, dozens of lights glowed across the valley floor. Tall stone buildings rose above the trees, and a massive castle stood at the center, overlooking everything below. It looked ancient and powerful beneath the moonlight. Emily whispered softly, "That is your home." Adrian followed her gaze toward the valley. Yes. Emily watched the castle grow larger as the carriage continued forward. Something about the place felt both beautiful and intimidating at the same time. A thought slowly formed in her mind as the carriage approached the valley gates. If your people have lived here for centuries, then humans must have discovered this place before. Adrian's voice grew quieter. Some have. Emily turned back toward him. And what happened to them? Adrian's eyes reflected the distant lights of the castle for a long moment before he answered. Most chose to forget what they saw. Emily sensed that the truth behind that statement held far more weight than the simple words suggested. As the carriage rolled through the tall iron gates of the valley, she realized that the life she once knew in Hollow Creek had already begun to fade behind her, and the world waiting ahead would reveal secrets far older than anything she had ever imagined. The carriage rolled deeper into the valley until the towering castle walls rose above them like dark stone cliffs touched by silver moonlight. Emily Carter leaned slightly toward the window, unable to look away from the sight before her. The castle looked ancient beyond anything she had ever imagined. Tall spires rose into the night sky, and long banners moved slowly. In the mountain wind, warm golden lights glowed behind hundreds of tall windows, giving the fortress the strange feeling of both danger and welcome at the same time. As the carriage approached the wide iron gates of the inner courtyard, the horses slowed, and the massive gates opened silently, as if the castle itself had been waiting for their arrival. Guards dressed in dark coats stood along the walls watching the carriage pass through. Their eyes followed Adrian with immediate recognition and respect. None of them spoke, but each lowered his head slightly as the carriage rolled across the stone courtyard. Emily noticed the quiet reaction and turned toward Adrian with growing curiosity. They all know who you are without a word. Adrian answered calmly. They serve this kingdom. My arrival does not surprise them. The carriage stopped near the grand entrance of the castle, where a wide staircase led upward between two towering stone pillars. Marcus stepped down from the driver's seat and opened the carriage door. The cool mountain air drifted inside, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow from the high peaks surrounding the valley. Adrian stepped out first before turning to offer his hand to Emily. She hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. The strength of his grip felt steady and reassuring as she stepped down onto the stone courtyard. For a moment, she simply stood there looking up at the enormous castle rising above her. I have never seen anything like this. Adrian watched her reaction quietly. Most humans never do. Emily turned slowly, taking in the vast courtyard and the silent guards positioned along the walls. Despite the size of the place, there was no chaos or noise. Everything moved with calm purpose, as if the entire castle followed a quiet rhythm she could not yet understand. Marcus approached again and spoke respectfully to Adrian. The healers have been informed of your arrival, my lord. Adrian nodded slightly. Good. Emily glanced toward him in confusion. Healers. Adrian looked at the marks across her back where the whip had struck earlier that night. Your injuries need attention before anything else. Emily instinctively brushed a hand against her shoulder, though she had almost forgotten the pain during the long carriage ride. It is not that serious. Adrian's voice remained firm but gentle. That decision is not yours tonight. Emily blinked slightly at the calm authority in his tone, but found herself unable to argue. Two women wearing dark green robes appeared near the entrance and approached them quickly with respectful bows. One of them carried a small lantern, while the other held a wooden case filled with medical supplies. Marcus gestured toward Emily. This is the one His Majesty mentioned. The healers examined Emily carefully, and one of them spoke softly. The wounds are fresh, but not deep. They will heal quickly with proper treatment. Adrian inclined his head slightly. Then see that it is done. The women nodded and gently guided Emily toward the castle entrance. She hesitated for a moment before looking back toward Adrian again. You are not coming. Adrian stood near the base of the staircase, watching her with a thoughtful expression. I will join you soon. Emily studied him for a moment before allowing the healers to lead her inside the castle doors. The interior was even more breathtaking than the outside. Tall stone columns lined a massive hall lit by chandeliers that cast warm golden light across polished marble floors. Paintings of ancient figures hung along the walls, and Emily could feel the weight of history surrounding every step she took. Yet even as the healers guided her deeper into the castle, she could not stop thinking about Adrian's words earlier in the carriage. A king whose people lived in the night. As she disappeared down the long hallway, Adrian remained in the courtyard beneath the moonlight, unaware that high above them on one of the castle balconies a pale figure had been watching their arrival in complete silence. The observer leaned slightly over the stone railing, eyes fixed on the castle doors where Emily had just vanished. After several moments, the figure whispered quietly into the darkness. So the lonely king finally brought a human home. Emily Carter sat quietly in a tall chair beside a wide window while the healers finished wrapping clean cloth around the last mark on her back. The pain had faded into a dull ache now, and the cool night air drifting through the castle halls carried a strange sense of peace she had never known before. The healer closed the wooden case and smiled gently. You were fortunate His Majesty found you tonight. Emily looked down at the bandage around her shoulder. I know. The healer bowed her head respectfully before leaving the chamber, and the heavy door closed with a soft sound behind her. For a moment, Emily remained alone in the quiet room. The castle around her felt enormous and ancient, yet not frightening. The silence here was different from the silence of Hollow Creek. It did not carry fear. It carried patience. After a few minutes, the door opened again, and Adrian stepped inside. His dark coat moved softly as he walked across the room toward her. Emily stood up slowly. The healers say the wounds will heal quickly. Adrian nodded. They are very skilled. Emily studied his face carefully. Earlier in the courtyard, you said your people have protected this valley for centuries. Adrian rested one hand lightly against the back of a nearby chair. Yes. Emily hesitated before asking the question that had remained in her mind since the moment she stepped inside the castle. Then why did you stop for me? Adrian did not answer immediately. The moonlight from the window fell across the floor between them as he considered her question. Finally, he spoke quietly. Because when I saw you standing in that square, you reminded me of someone. Emily tilted her head slightly. Someone from your past. Adrian nodded once. Long ago, there was a woman who showed me what courage looked like. She stood against cruelty even when it cost her everything. Emily watched him carefully. What happened to her? Adrian's gaze drifted briefly toward the window where the moon hung above the mountains. She died protecting others who could not defend themselves. The calm tone of his voice carried a deep sadness that had clearly existed for many years. Emily stepped a little closer. So when you saw me tonight, you remembered her. Adrian looked back at her again. Yes. Emily let out a slow breath. Then I'm glad she existed. Adrian studied her expression for a moment before allowing the faintest smile to appear. So am I. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The quiet room felt warmer now than the cold night they had left behind in Hollow Creek. Finally, Emily asked the question that mattered most. What happens to me now? Adrian answered honestly. That depends on what you want. Emily blinked. What I want. Adrian nodded. You are free. The debt is gone and no one here will force you to stay. If you wish to leave tomorrow, my people will escort you safely beyond these mountains. Emily walked slowly toward the window and looked out across the valley where lights from the castle village glowed softly below. A few hours earlier, she had been tied to a post waiting for the next strike of a whip. Now, she stood inside a castle hidden in the mountains beside a king who had saved her life. She turned back toward Adrian. Hollow Creek was never truly my home. Adrian waited silently. Emily continued with quiet certainty. But perhaps this place could be. Adrian studied her for a moment before speaking. Life among my people will not be simple. Humans rarely live within vampire kingdoms. Emily smiled faintly. My life was not simple before either. Adrian considered her answer before nodding slowly. Then you may stay as long as you wish. Emily met his gaze with gratitude shining in her eyes. Thank you, Adrian. Adrian stepped closer and spoke with calm assurance. From this night forward, you are safe here. Emily Carter once stood alone in a town square while the world looked away. But in the quiet valley hidden among the mountains, she found something stronger than fear. She found protection. She found new beginning. And the lonely vampire king who had once walked the night alone discovered that sometimes the smallest act of courage could change the course of eternity.